Just to kind of reiterate who I am. Um, Nick Newberry. I'm a high school environmental science teacher. It's a second career for me. I used to be a professional environmental scientist, working for a consulting firm doing biodiversity assessments for public and private entities. But teaching has been a really awesome career for me the last 4 years. I've been bird watching and paying attention to birds as long as I can remember. My spark bird, which a lot of people talk about a spark bird being something that they, um, a bird that really sparked their passion for birding and really got them sort of zeroed in on it. And for me, that happened, I think it was second grade with the common grackle. When I was, however old people are in second grade, maybe 8 years old, I thought I knew all the birds because there's blue jays and robins and orioles, and I kind of knew those. But then I heard about grackle, and it sounded like this incredibly exotic bird, and that just, for whatever reason, sparked my passion. I started flipping through. Yeah, I see someone, yeah, putting their spark birds. I think that's kind of a fun thing to share with people. Um, so yeah, so my spark bird was common grackle, and ever since then, the rest has been history. I was a young birder in the Northern Virginia Teen Bird Club, which is still going, run by Fred Atwood out of Flint Hill School in Oakton, where I live. Um, and yeah, I went to College of William and Mary, where I founded the Bird Club, which is now in its 10th year. I'm really excited about that. I think hopefully we'll get some celebrations for them planned this year. I'm also a member of the Virginia Society of Ornithology board, and it's on the VARCOM committee, which is the Virginia Avian Records Committee. But what we do, we're supposed to be the people who know how to identify birds, as some of the top people in the state. Ask people and see what they think about that. But I've thought a lot about bird identification over the years, so here to share a bit about that, and sort of my view on birds a little bit more holistically as well. So I wanted to first start off with some acknowledgments. Acknowledgments are sort of important for me because birds don't exist in a vacuum. And I appreciate birds for a lot of reasons, and I care about their identification, but I just wanted to acknowledge two things in particular here. The first, oops, go back. All right, so the first is just where birds are right now. So this is a study put out by the Cornell lab in 2019, just looking at how much birds have declined in the last several decades. So they've declined a lot. And the reason why I bring this up is because identification is, I think, a wonderful way to connect with birds, but we also have to have birds out there to identify. And the fewer birds there are out there, the less rich our birding can be. And we already have a shadow of the birds that used to be. And I know several birders who within their lifetime, it's been very easy for them to see this decline. And I don't necessarily say this to be depressing. I just want to acknowledge it as something that I think is important to just keep in mind as we think about this. The second is more of a personal thing to me. This bird here is called the Palestine sunbird, and I just want to acknowledge the ongoing plight of the people in Palestine, particularly in Gaza. It's a cause that's important to me for a few reasons, and so I just want to acknowledge that. And with that, we will move on. All right, so acknowledgments on identification. So all about the acknowledgments today. So I think there's a bit of a tendency in the birding community to see people who identify the birds the best as the top birders. But Ken Kaufman, who's one of the sort of public faces of birding in North America, he wrote a really famous book about him doing a big year, which is when he went around the United States and Canada looking for as many birds as possible back in the 70s, I think. And it was sort of this like birding coming of age story. He hitchhiked all over the country, saw some really cool birds, and that sort of put his name on the map. But he says that the person who is the best birder is someone who's enjoying the birds. So while this will be about identification, I just want to acknowledge that it's not all about identification. You can be a good birder just by enjoying your time out with birds. And that's what this smiley face is for. Uh, Photography can also be a great way to interact with birds that doesn't have anything to do with identifying. Photography can be a great way to help learn how to identify birds because you can take a snapshot of a bird that might be really active and zero in on parts of the bird that can help you identify it. But you don't have to necessarily identify the birds. You can just take pictures of them. Another great way that people interact with birds is through art. Again, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with identification, but they can be linked. All right, so we're done with the acknowledgements here. So I want to talk about how to find birds first, because if you're not finding them, it can be really frustrating to identify them. The easiest birds to identify are the ones that you can see well. So especially during spring migration, I have a few sort of tricks that have helped me a lot. The first is around habitat. So some of the most productive places for finding the most amount of birds in the best viewing conditions in sort of the shortest amount of time can be along edges. So on the right of the screen here, we have a field next to some trees. And a lot of times edges can be just really wonderful places where you can kind of step back a little bit and have a better view of the canopy and higher up in the trees, because there are a lot of bird species, especially warblers, that spend a lot of their time up high. And if you're in the middle of the woods, some of those canopy birds just can be so difficult to see. And so if you can go to an edge and have good lighting and step back from the edge, maybe 50 to 100 feet, it makes it easier to see the tops of the trees without craning your neck too much. And in fact, there's a common sort of ailment in the birding community referred to as warbler neck. And that occurs when people spend a lot of time looking like this up in a tree trying to see warblers. And so warbler neck can be helped by getting on an edge and getting a bit away from those trees so that you have a more shallow angle of viewing the birds. And then another way actually you can help warbler neck is just to lie down on the ground if you're comfortable with that. Something I do occasionally. So the other habitat that tends to be really great for spring migrating birds is running water, and especially streams. So one of the most famous, well-known places for watching spring warblers in particular around Northern Virginia is called Monticello Park. It's in Alexandria, I believe. And it has a running brook that, especially in the middle of the day, I think, maybe also in the morning, birds will come down and bathe in the running water. My understanding is that birds can hear the bubbling of a brook, the trickling of the water, and they know that's a place that's shallow where they can probably go down to take a bath and maybe get a drink of water if they need it. And so finding a good stream and maybe just sitting there and watching for a period of time, 15 minutes or more probably, is a great way to see some of these birds that spend a lot of time in the canopy coming down low, where you can see them. They're not really stressed any more than they would be naturally. And you can see their whole bodies instead of just the underside of their tail, which is often the view that you get when you're looking straight up into the canopy. All right, so technique, binoculars. I like to talk about binoculars. A lot of birders use binoculars. Not all of them do, but most birders use binoculars. Binoculars come in all different types, all different qualities. I encourage people to go to a store, an optics store, which a lot of times bird stores like Wild Birds Unlimited, for example, will have a selection of optics and you can try them out. You can take a deep dive on online recommendations. There are all sorts of help articles out there for how to find the right binoculars. But in the end of the day, it's what feels comfortable in your hands, what works with your eyes, and what you're willing to pay for them. So I encourage a good pair of binoculars if you want to try to get a closer look at birds. And it really does help with the identification. A camera, you don't need a fancy camera, but a camera does help. Especially as you're learning, you can observe a bird in the field, then take a picture and go back home to review the bird and compare it with a field guide and really spend some more time learning how to identify it. Just before I get too much more into this, when would you like me to wrap up since we got a bit of a late start?
Finish your presentation, Nick.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. And then another word on technique is I can't stress this enough, but lighting is super, super important. So that's why I got a little sun up here. Having the sun come from over your shoulder is a really important consideration when looking for birds and photographing them. It's not always possible to get the best lighting, but I strongly encourage it. And also, in the early mornings, the trees that are lit up by the sun tend to have a lot of birds in them. And what I've heard and what I think is probably true is that the sun warms up and some of the little caterpillars and inchworms and things that the birds eat start moving a little bit earlier. And so birds tend to go there. Also, it can be kind of chilly. So birds will often go to the warmer areas. Just the other week, I saw a hawk warming itself in the sun. And so I think there's something there. So a couple things there about light. All right, so timing with warblers and other migrating birds and really birds in general in this spring migration, it really pays to get out there early. You can find birds at any time of day. So if you have a lunch break at work and you want to get outside and look for birds, I encourage that. You just don't expect to have quite the activity that you can have in the morning. I've just had some magical mornings in May where I step outside at 5 a.m. and just the whole forest is alive with birdsong. And it's a really special thing. You just don't get that later in the day. There does tend to be a bit of a resurgence in activity about 2 hours or so before sunset. But the best action's right around sunrise, which in May is really early. So if you can get up, I definitely encourage it, although it can certainly be tricky. Yeah. Oh, and so in terms of looking for migrating birds, we already have spring migrants returning, not so much warblers. Although the first pine warblers will probably be showing up here soon. First Louisiana water thrushes should be showing up as well. But the peak of warbler migration, and I'll talk a bit more about warblers if that's not a group you're familiar with yet. Warblers, vireos, thrushes, these birds tend to come through the most around early to mid-May. So that's really when the most magic happens. So I want to paint a picture here a bit of what the birds are doing in May and why April and May tend to be so awesome. So this is the Blackpool warbler, which is one of the more common warblers to come through here, and it's on the later end of migration. So they typically peak in the third week of May. Just to give you a sense of how far they migrate. I spent a couple of summers working in Fairbanks, Alaska, with the Department of Fish and Game studying a different bird, the olive-sided flycatcher. And we would see Blackpool warblers all the way up there. And those birds, they don't have a normal migration route that goes down the west coast. So those birds that I saw in Alaska very well could be the same birds that I saw in my backyard here, which kind of just blows my mind. But they're stopping by in our backyards and our parks, and a lot of them are continuing up north. There are some birds that will spend the summer here, but a lot of them keep moving north of us. So just want to put this here because this kind of blows my mind. These tiny little birds can move so far. And then I want to talk about another thing. This is a free service put out by Cornell. So a lot of you are probably used to checking the weather forecast, but there's also this thing called Birdcast, which takes predictive modeling using wind, weather data, and makes predictions about when and where bird migration will be the hottest. So I encourage you, if you're kind of interested in that sort of stuff, to poke around on the Birdcast website. It has some really cool new features, like things that can tell you how many birds flew over your county. So you can look at how many birds are predicted to have flown or are judged to have flown over Loudoun County the prior night. And they use Doppler radar, is my understanding, which is a really sophisticated radar system that can see things the size of songbirds. So if you're into that kind of thing, definitely encourage checking it out, spending some time on it. So before we get even more into the identification, I want to talk about a couple of resources that are out there. So we've got this field guides, which back in the day, and this is how I learned, there were bird books, and you would go and find a bird and then flip through the bird book until you found a good match. And inside that bird book, it would have pointers on how to identify different birds from each other, especially similar looking species. So yeah, that's kind of the old school way to do it. I haven't seen too many people out with field guides anymore, and I don't use mine all that often anymore, although I do use it occasionally. Now people are using apps a bit more, and so I encourage people to use Merlin, and I believe that there's a future LWC program on Merlin. We can sort of plug at the end here, but it's a free app from Cornell, and it can do a couple things. If you take a picture of the bird, it has an AI system that will identify it for you, and it does a pretty good job. I've been very impressed with it. But the feature that most people seem to be really excited about is the audio ID feature. So you can hit record and it identifies birds that it hears. It's not perfect, but again, I've been very impressed with its ability to identify birds from their calls, their songs, and even kind of obscure songs. And I was on the team that helped train the model. And yeah, it seems like it's pretty impressive, and you can carry it around with you. So it's a way to decode the sound around you without kind of doing the old style way of following the bird around that you hear until you find it, you lay eyes on it, and then you identify it, or going out with someone who knows the birds and can help you identify them, sort of like a mentor style. And I still encourage people to not always just use Merlin, to let yourself learn the hard way sometimes. If you hear an unfamiliar bird song, actually go and follow it until you find the bird, because I think there's something to be said for learning birds better if you put in that extra effort and you have a bit of a story behind the identification rather than just Merlin spitting out the identification for you. And I also encourage going on guided walks. I think LWC puts on a few throughout the year, and by a few, I think it's several. So I encourage going out with someone who's done this a lot. But yeah, always take Merlin with a grain of salt, because it's not perfect. All right, so field marks. Field marks are what we use in they're kind of like a basic term in field identification. They're specific features of a bird that are used to identify it and separate it from other species. So this one is called a yellow-rumped warbler. You wouldn't know from this picture, but it has a yellow rump. So I put in this picture. These are both by Pam Miller. Just a quick note on the photos. All of the bird photos here are actually from LWC's archives, and I did my best, or I attributed them to the people who took them in the slideshow. So you might see your name or someone you know going forward here. So on the yellow-rumped warbler, we have a few different field marks here. I'm just going to kind of point out a few. We've got a white throat. We have these white eye crescents, a black bill that's kind of thin and pointed, a little tubular. These yellow spots on the flanks, these white wing bars, white under the tail, white belly, and black feet. And then, of course, once we get to the back, it has a bright yellow rump. There are other warblers that have a yellow rump. Cape May warbler is one. So whenever you're using field marks, and field marks are pointed out in all field guides, and also mentioned in most online or in most app field guides. You want to use more than one field mark, because just using one field mark doesn't really rule out all the birds. So, this is kind of hard to be interactive here, but I wanted to bring this one up. This is a bird. This is a female warbler, and I want to talk about some of the field marks here. So if we go back, I want to look at the bill first, because bills can be a really great way to identify birds and separate it from each other. But if we look at the bill on this bird, the yellow-rumped warbler, compared to this one, to my eye, the bills are pretty similar. So that's not a good, really differentiating field mark. But there are a lot of other differences. So if we think about wing bars, yellow-rumped warbler has two bright wing bars. This bird does not really have much in the way of wing bars. This has a yellow belly versus our white belly. Has some black streaking on the chest, which this one also has, but the black streaking is different. So these are just a sense of different field marks. I think these birds are pretty obviously different. This is a prairie warbler. By the looks of it, a female prairie warbler. Yeah. Here's another one. If we look at the bill and we compare the bill between this one and the prairie warbler, now we start to see some pretty big differences in the bill. This one has kind of an ivory colored thick bill versus the thin black bill here. And this one is a little bit more simplistic. It's bright red, scarlet red, and jet black wings, and this is a scarlet tanager. So we're talking about warblers. There's around 30 species that can be found in this area. The warblers in general are kind of talked about as the gems of the woodlands. And I think they're really cool, and a lot of birders are really drawn to them. They can be tricky to see because they move around a lot, but with enough patience, you can get some good views of them. They're really special, but they are not the only stars of the show. This scarlet tanager, there's nothing like seeing a scarlet tanager in good light. Even the best pictures I've seen fail to capture the true scarlet nature of it. So I really encourage you getting out and seeing one of these. The color red is so different from a cardinal. Just wild looking. So we've got tanagers, we've got cuckoos, flycatchers. There's a whole slew of other birds out there. So while warblers are wonderful, they're not the only ones out there. So male and female plumage, these photos are both by Diane. So most warbler species have a distinctive male and female plumage. These are both black-throated green warblers, with a male on the left with a really extensive black bib, and then the female on the right with a white throat and just a little bit of black kind of on the upper part of the chest. So the spring is kind of nice in a lot of ways. It's easier than the fall for identification because you typically just have the male and the female plumage, and there are no juveniles around anymore. American redstarts are a bit of an exception. They take a couple years to reach their full male plumage. But as far as I can remember, all the other ones are just male and female. And so you can look at one or the other, but just know that they're different plumages and they look a little bit different. So we're going to move on now from warblers. I encourage you, if you're interested in warblers, to just get out there and just spend time looking for them, using Merlin, using just your, no screens, no Merlin, and just going out there and trying to puzzle this stuff out, and just going there and looking for the birds. It's going to take a little bit of time to learn these, but I think that journey to getting better at identification is a big part of the joy. Because with bird identification, you're never done. There's always something that's more difficult to identify. So it's not like you're trying to become the expert on warblers or the expert on one of these things. And once you get to a point, you're done. anyone who's called an expert in these warblers or gulls or really anything is always still learning and refining their craft and finding exceptions to the rules. In warblers, there are weird hybrids. I've seen one before and it really blew my mind. Um, there are hybrid back crosses. There are warblers that sing other warblers' songs. There's all sorts of ways you can go with this. But get out there and just start learning and piecing it together. I want to give a nod to shorebirds. So this is a red knot. Red knot, a bird that also blows my mind in terms of its migration. They have somewhat shifting migrations from what they used to have, but a lot of them still fly to the southern end of South America and then go all the way up to the Canadian and Alaskan Arctic to breed. And in the foreground here in the front right, we see horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs lay millions of eggs, especially around here in the Delaware Bay. And these birds, red knots and a dozen or so other shorebirds, fuel up on them every year before flying further north. So I encourage going out there, and the peak for shorebirds is a little bit later than the peak for songbirds. It's typically the third week to fourth week in May. So once you've had your fill of the spring migrants and they start to taper off a bit, I encourage checking out the Delaware Bay, Bombay Hook, National Wildlife Refuge, and there are a few other places out there as well. All right, so one of my other favorite activities in the identification world for birds in the spring is swallows. So this is a barn swallow. Swallows in the spring will tend to form big flocks over fields and bodies of water. And one of my favorite activities is to just go to a field or body of water where there are a lot of swallows and just watch them. They fly really fast, but they tend to do loops over the pond, so you can get on the same bird. You'll lose it when it flies to the other end of the pond, and then it comes back. And here we have, I think, 5 regularly occurring species of swallows, but there's the possibility for some more rare species. But I just really like swallows. And in terms of weather, when it gets stormy or cold or windy, that's when the swallows tend to get lower to the ground and be found low over ponds and fields. So yeah, it's another nod to another bird group. So I want to just touch briefly on merlin and how best to use merlin. Here on the right, we have a male prairie warbler by Michael, actually. So in terms of using merlin, it's a tool, and like any tool, it's the better you get at using it, the more you'll get out of it. So with merlin, if you're using the sound identification like a lot of people use, definitely encourage people to go find quieter areas, but also kind of walk towards the birds, swap between listening and looking at the app, because the app will actually show you a picture of the sound. It's called a spectrograph. So you can kind of visualize. If you're more of a visual learner, you can actually look at the pattern of the song and match that to what you're hearing. That helps some people. But again, taking what merlin spits out at you with a grain of salt, I think is important, because it does trip up from time to time. But also all the same techniques I gave you earlier about going to areas that are edges or near streams where you have higher concentrations of birds can be a good way to get more out of merlin. I also encourage people to follow up on birds that merlin identifies. So not just seeing the bird and checking it off your list, but actually go find it. Merlin can be the beginning of the adventure as opposed to the end of the adventure. Digibinning and lighting. So this is something that's been around for a while. So there are ways to take your phone and you can put it up to binoculars or scope to take a picture of birds. And you can put those birds into merlin, or you can just have them, and if you use eBird, you can upload them to eBird. So that's just something you can do. It takes a bit of practice, and there are tutorials on YouTube to check out. But a word of caution on photos is lighting makes a really big difference. So this is an eastern phoebe on the right. And they do tend to have yellow tinged bellies, but I think it's a bit more yellow here than it might be in real life. And a lot of times if birds are next to bright green leaves or bright yellow flowers, that can reflect on the bird and make the color look a bit different. And this gets exacerbated in digibinning just because of the quality of the optics. It's a bit different than if you have a camera that's actually dedicated to taking photos. But this can be a great way to get pictures and not have to carry around a big camera. And again, with lighting, having light coming from over your shoulder behind you, and especially lighting in the beginning of the day or the end of the day when it's less harsh, can help with better outcomes. All right, so I also want to talk about birder identities, so identifying birds, but also birders have different identities. And we're in an age where there's all sorts of different bird clubs. So if you identify um, as someone who is trans or someone who has a disability of some type, or um, you you're a person of color, or you want to be in a place with a club, either in person or on social media, where you feel like you're with an affinity group, so a group of people who have share similar identities or similar values. They're cropping up all over the place, and this is just a small sort of sliver of that. Um, Again, like we're birders, we're people, so we all have our own identities, and not to say that if you have to, like, if you're trans, you have to go to the Trans Birders Club, but sometimes that's a helpful place to go just to feel sort of safe and understood. And so I encourage you, if you have any sort of non-majority identity or whatever, to go and seek out that sort of club, because it might exist out there already, or you could start it. I want to give a shout out, because this is supposed to be more of a youth birder thing, to um, media and social media in particular that I've found are kind of interesting, that I like. So cellular tracking technology, or CTT, on Instagram, they put out a lot of really cool maps about birds that they're tracking that can help you have a bit more of an appreciation for where that Blackburnian warbler you're looking at might be flying to or from, and that sort of thing. Corinna Newsom at Hood Naturalist, I really like a lot of her content. Intersectional Environmentalist gets at looking at the environment and environmental conservation, not just through the lens of environment, but intersectional, meaning intersections with social justice and environmental justice. So definitely encourage checking them out. Also, I love Life List, a birding podcast by George Armistead, Molly Brown, and Alvaro Jaramillo. They talk ad nauseum about birds. Between the three of them, they have decades and decades of experience about birds. So I encourage giving them a listen. So call to action, as I acknowledged in the beginning, birds are really struggling, and that's due to a lot of things. It's due to habitat loss. It's also due to climate change increasingly. We see sea level rise, which has been a major contributor to losing the black rail in Virginia. So black rail used to breed throughout coastal Virginia and some areas in interior Virginia, and it's a high marsh species, and it's been pushed out, at least in the coastal area, partially by sea level rise, partially also by predation from cats, foxes, raccoons, and things like that related to human development. So I encourage getting involved in some way to give back to birds in sort of like an act of reciprocity. LWC, I'm just so impressed with all the advocacy they do locally in terms of education, but also getting involved in some of the less glamorous stuff, some of the advocacy that can get kind of politically messy, but is so important to advocate for the birds. So maybe, go on your bird walks and attend lectures like these, but also see if you can get involved in some way to help on your local scale. American Bird Conservancy is headquartered in this area as well, but they work not just in the United States, but across the Americas to help conserve birds all over really the Western Hemisphere. And yeah, if you're someone who's in the position to contribute financially, they can be a great place to contribute financially, but I also really appreciate the literature they put out and some of the resources they have. If you're youth and you have maybe climate anxiety is a term that gets put out a lot. I encourage checking out the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth-led movement to push action on climate change at the local, state, national, international level.